Welcome back to Not Another Mummy podcast with me, Alison Perry. My guest today is living proof that it's possible to take the knocks that life gives you and use them to fuel you to succeed. Zain Asher is a CNN anchor based in New York and a mum of 2 boys. Her book, Where the Children Take Us, is a memoir detailing her family's sacrifices, strength and determination. It follows her parents' journey from war-torn Nigeria to settling in South London to raise their children. When Zain was 5 years old, tragedy struck and her father was killed in a road accident. An accident that nearly killed her older brother Chiwetel and left her mother to raise 4 children single-handed. Zain talks to me about how her mother's inner strength, along with the rituals of radical mothering from her village in Nigeria, resulted in her 4 children being hugely successful. Zain being a CNN anchor herself, Chiwetel being an Oscar-nominated actor, and their siblings being a doctor and entrepreneur. It's a hugely inspiring story of one family's experiences, and I am so grateful to Zain for chatting with me about it. Zain, a warm welcome to the podcast today. It is midday here in the UK, but it's 7 a.m. where you are in New York, isn't it?
Yes, I woke up about an hour and a half ago. So, yeah, but thank you so much for having me.
Are you a bit of an early bird generally? Do you have to be up bright and early to prepare for your CNN show?
I do. I mean, at the beginning when the show launched a year ago, we're talking 4 a.m. wake-ups. Now that it's more established, I think we're in the groove of 5:30 a.m. That's when I start my day usually.
I mean, it's early though, right? 5:30. That's
I know. But the thing is, once you have kids, before I had children, I thought that, 5 a.m. I never woke up at that time unless I had a flight to catch or something.
Yeah.
Once you have children, you get used to seeing regular sort of 4 a.m. wake ups, 5:30 a.m. So it's actually now become quite normal to me. My youngest is 8 months old.
Oh,
so
goodness.
It wasn't so long ago that, we were doing every 2 hours through the night. So, I'm grateful. If he makes it to 5 in the morning without waking up, I'm so ecstatic.
So how old was he when you started doing your CNN show? He must have been very young.
Well, so, I've been at CNN for in total over 10 years and I have 2 children. So I have a 3-year-old and an 8-month-old. So when I launched this new show, because I got promoted last year, I was pregnant actually. And so then a few months later I gave birth and then I was on maternity leave for a bit and I came back in November. So, yeah.
And that's pretty cool, right? Because you hear so many stories and, so many women share experiences of not getting that promotion when they're pregnant or, being passed over for opportunities. So that's pretty good.
I'm so lucky. Because, CNN is an environment where a lot of the sort of top jobs are actually led by women. So there's a lot of women in the C-suite. There are so many women executives. There are so many, obviously, female anchors. So the idea of not giving someone a promotion because they're pregnant, it just generally doesn't really happen at CNN. Obviously, for a lot of other companies, it's certainly a different story. But for me, I'm very, very lucky to work at a company that is understanding in that sense.
That's great. And your job does seem to afford you amazing experiences, because just this week you were at the Oscars with your husband, weren't you?
Yes, I was. And I was in the room when all of that happened. So
I don't know what you're talking about, because there's been no coverage. There were no news stories coming out of the Oscars this week.
No, but we just, like everybody else, thought it was a joke, at the beginning, and then we slowly began to realize, wait a minute, maybe this isn't staged. And that was when Will Smith started using foul language. He famously doesn't even swear in his songs. And so you realize that it was actually quite serious. So, everybody was on the edge of their seats, especially when he won the Oscar, because it was sort of like, wow, we're actually going to hear from him after he actually now is going to be able to try to, I guess, explain himself after what he did. And so, it was quite the Oscars to attend. I'll tell you that much.
Quite the experience. When you're at these sort of things, do you have that sort of pinch me moment, or are you quite blasé about it? I mean, because at the end of the day, it must feel like I've just, I grew up in South London, and, people from South London don't go to the Oscars, yet here I am.
Well, it's my second time at the Oscars. My brother was nominated for Best Actor for 12 Years.
So were you there
Slave.
when he was nominated?
Yes, I was there when he was nominated. So that was a pinch me moment, because it's sort of a very different experience when you're not just attending the Oscars, but you're with somebody who's nominated for Best Actor. It's a very, very different experience. Who you meet, and, all the different sort of events you get to go to. And the whole experience was just wild, because, we're from West Norwood. Who would have ever thought that, I'd be attending the Oscars, not just attending, but actually watching my brother be nominated. It's unbelievable. Actually, even now I think back at it. So that was my first experience. And then this week I got to go just through CNN. So they get tickets. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I mean, and this is what's so wonderful about your book. So your book, Where the Children Take Us, it's about triumph over tragedy, isn't it? It's about taking the knocks that life gives you and using them to fuel you to succeed, which, we can all see that you and your siblings have absolutely done. I mean, not that West Norwood, it's not like you grew up, we're talking about it, I'm talking about it like it's, some absolutely terrible place. It really isn't. I live not far from West Norwood. I live in Bromley, so I'm just down the road.
Oh, yeah, I know, close by.
I know the area you grew up in well, and it's
so
lovely.
That's so funny.
But the book, it absolutely starts with, the story, I guess, begins with your parents being in Nigeria and meeting, and then moving to London to start their family, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the book is filled with so many celebratory moments, but also a lot of pain and tragedy as well. In the first chapter, I talk about probably what still is the worst day in my family's life. And it was September 1988. And my mother was in the living room, and it was early evening, and she got a phone call. And the voice on the other end of the line simply said, "Your husband and your son have been involved in a car crash. One of them is dead, and we don't know which one." And you can imagine just the level of utter devastation, the sort of emotional earthquake that moment entailed. And it turned out to be my father who had passed away. My father and brother were on a father-son road trip in Nigeria. And it was my dad's idea, because growing up in London, he really wanted my brother to get a better sense of who he was, his culture, his background. And so they were on the road leaving Enugu, which is where we're from originally, going to Lagos, which is the main city, the busiest city in Nigeria. And on the way, their car was hit by a tractor trailer. And initially, I talk about this in the book, the authorities thought that everybody had died instantly. And then it emerged hours later that maybe one person had survived, perhaps a little boy had survived. Everybody, because authorities thought that everybody had passed away, everybody was taken to the morgue. And it was only when they arrived at the morgue that somebody realized that my brother was still breathing. And so it was such a difficult time in my family's life. I mean, my mother, who, by the way, traveled to Nigeria without knowing who in her family she was going to be burying that week, because there was just so much confusion as to whether, both of them had passed away or whether there was actually one survivor, so much uncertainty. You think about sort of that level of pain, and the fact that through that pain, obviously it was very difficult for the first several months, where my mother would just lock herself in her bedroom and cry for days and days at a time. But eventually, when she emerged from that grief, she really fought for us. She carried us on her back and fought with every fiber of her being to give us a better life. And I talk about in the book just some of the things that she did. I mean, because of her tough love style, her resilience, her relentless discipline, I mean, she is the reason why my siblings and I have surpassed every expectation for a family in those circumstances. Because of her, I'm now an anchor at CNN. My brother, who, by the way, was the one that was taken to the morgue that day, is now an Oscar-nominated actor for his role in 12 Years a Slave. And my sister is a doctor, and my oldest brother is a very successful entrepreneur. And so the book for me is really a celebration of my mother. I list out in the book just some of the things that she did, some of the extraordinary, really remarkable things that she did to fight for us, because her whole goal was to make sure that we were able to focus on anything besides, that empty chair at the dinner table. And I'm incredibly proud of her. And so that's what the book is about.
And I love how you describe, you talk about how you and your siblings experienced some racism growing up in South London. And I love how you describe, what your mum did by regularly showing you all of the West African and Black people who had achieved brilliant things, whether it was books or newspaper cuttings or, I guess, the music you were listening to. Like you talk about that Lighthouse Family in the 90s and... like filling your home with this kind of Black positivity.
Absolutely. So what she would do was she would find newspaper clippings in The Guardian, The Times, Telegraph, any article that showed a Black person, especially if they were West African, a Black person who had overcome something and soared, a Black person who had excelled in their chosen profession, and she would cut them out and she would plaster them to our walls. So we would come home, and in our hallways, there would be image after image after image of Black people who had thrived. And so that really had a profound effect, because it changed. There's a belief, that really the only thing that can hold a person back in life is the perception that they have of themselves. And my mother really changed the perception we had of ourselves by showing us examples of Black people who had done remarkable things. She really upended, at least in our minds, what it meant to be Black and what Black people were capable of achieving. And she drilled it into us that if we worked as hard as they did, then we could have what they had. And so that was so powerful because it changed our subconscious beliefs.
Yeah. And you talk quite specifically about the, the whole triumph over tragedy and taking the knocks that life gives you. You talk about this being something that is very ingrained in Nigerian culture. Why do you think that Nigeria as a place produces, this drive in so many?
I think that's a great question. I think that, anyone who has traveled to Nigeria and spent any time there, there is a lot to love and to cherish about Nigeria, but the country does have a lot of problems. I was there on a recent trip about a month ago, and, to get anything done, you're contending with, there's no electricity, there's little or no cell phone service in certain places. And so to get anything done oftentimes takes an entire day. Like, I'm grateful in that kind of environment if I get one thing done the whole day. When I come back to America, I'm grateful because of how productive I can be. So when you take somebody who is in that kind of environment and how you have to do battle every single day to get simple things done, you sort of transport that person into the West, where I'm not going to say that everything's so easy, but certainly it is much easier, if you, in terms of, productivity at the very least. You transport them into that environment and then they thrive, they really can have the opportunity to excel. And I think that is part of it. My mother herself came of age during the Biafra War. And that really is still to this day one of the deadliest, one of the most horrific wars in African history. It lasted 2.5 years, which might seem relatively short, but what people went through during that time, during that short 2.5 year period, is really the stuff of nightmares. We're talking about people having to eat crickets and snakes to survive. We're talking about soldiers having literally no food. The images from the Biafra War were very prominent in this country and in America in the 1960s. I sort of feel though now people don't seem to know, or at least remember as much about it, but it was a dreadful time to live. And my mother's job, especially as the oldest child in her family, my grandmother had 7 children by that time. And as the oldest in her family, her job was to go to the market and sell cassava to sort of make sure that her own family didn't succumb to starvation like so many others did. And she risked her life doing that because the bombings were relentless. She would be at the market stall and suddenly you would hear sirens and suddenly there would be a flash of fire. There would be machine gun fire raining down. There would be an explosion and she would have to run for cover. And that's at 14, 15 years old. So you think about that as a training ground, if you will, for resilience. I think that is where, for my mother personally, that is where her strength comes from.
And all of these experiences, you talk about them, today, but also in your book, you do talk about them like you were there. And so I'm really interested. I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of these stories will be told as you're growing up and you share, stories and talk about things with family members. But how did you, when you were writing this book, did you go back and interview family members who were, at these places, having these conversations, feeling these feelings, because it really comes alive in the book?
Thank you. So, yes. So my dad passed away when I was 5 years old. And so, in order to really sort of paint a picture and give an accurate portrayal about his life, I had to interview dozens of people. So I'm talking about even my dad's high school friends, who were with him before the Biafra War started. And then extended relatives in our village. When my brother was moved from the morgue to a hospital, there was one sort of extended family member who was 19 years old at the time who stayed with him. And he was sort of in charge of looking after Chiwetel while he was in hospital before my mother came. But obviously my mother, when she did come, had so much to sort out because, yes, her son was in hospital, but she also had to arrange a funeral for the love of her life as well. And
she was pregnant at the time, wasn't she?
And she was pregnant at the time.
I mean, that's a lot.
With my little sister. So one of our extended relatives who was a teenager was looking after Chiwetel in hospital, and so great to reconnect with him, and to thank him again after all these years, and also for him to really paint an accurate portrayal of what it was like in the hospital, for example. With the Biafra War, a lot of the information came from my mother, because obviously she was 14, 15 during the Biafra War, and that's old enough to have a decent recollection. But also, my dad's brother worked for Colonel Ojukwu, who was the commander in charge of Biafra at the time. And so he wrote a book as well. And so the combination of all of that allowed me to really dig deep and paint an accurate of a picture as I could. So, yeah. Now,
you talked about the way that your mum raised you and, the values that came through. But tell me about your mum's plan to get you into Oxford University, because it was pretty extreme, wasn't it?
It was very extreme. And my mother, she had, I think for her, this idea of her daughter going to Oxford University. I mean, for a lot of immigrants, not just Nigerian immigrants, but I think for a lot of immigrants, there's this belief that Oxford and Cambridge are the ticket to a better life. And for my mother, whose education was interrupted during the Biafra War, she really appreciated what England had to offer her and her children in terms of education. I mean, she really treasured it and valued it. And she decided that she was not going to waste it. She was not going to waste this opportunity of a lifetime that she'd been given. And so we had discussed, this idea of me possibly going to Oxford. And at the time, I had good grades in school, but they were not Oxford material grades. I was not what I would call a straight A student by any stretch of the imagination, although I think I was a good student. And so one night she went upstairs and she sort of paced her bedroom and thought to herself, what can I do? How can I guarantee that my daughter is going to go to Oxford University? What can I do? And she came into my room and said, I've got it. I've got it. And I'm like, what, Mom? She's like, I've got a plan that is going to guarantee that you are going to go to Oxford. And I was like, okay, let's hear it. And she decided that she was going to ban me from watching any television whatsoever until I had an actual Oxford acceptance letter in hand. And I think for a lot of people hearing this, that does sound so extreme. But what my mother did for me is that by eliminating distractions, it meant that I had nothing else to do but study. That's what I did with my time. And I remember complaining to her, and I said to her, listen, there are lots of kids who watch TV all day and who, play video games and who still go to Oxford and Cambridge. And she would say to me, yes, you're right, but you're not one of those kids. You actually have to work. I know my children and you have to work. And she was right. I did have to work. I'm somebody who, if I'm going to go to that university, if I'm going to get 3 A's for A-levels, I have to work. And so she set up an environment where there was no other excuse. She also, because I started switching television for the phone and spending all my time talking on the phone with my friends, she also got one of those sort of small residential payphones, which, just look like normal phones, but have a slot on the side for coins. So if I wanted to talk to my friends, I had to pay 20p a minute, which meant I didn't talk to my friends at all. Or if I did, my conversations were very, very quick. Or they had to call me. And so, that environment, that kind of sort of choice, either I can just do nothing or I can open a book. And, eventually I said, okay, whatever, I'll open a book. And I would read, and it began to be, it sort of became something that I reluctantly began to enjoy. And it really paid off. And so, sometimes people ask me, well, are you going to do the same thing with your children? Are your children not going to be allowed to watch television? And I haven't really decided yet, because my children are growing up in a very, very different time. It's not just television. It's also tablets. It's iPhones. It's, YouTube. It's Netflix. It's social media. I wouldn't even know how to begin to control that. And my son is only 3, so I don't have to yet, thank God. But, I will say that for me personally, it paid off. Because if you are, a Nigerian girl and you are a child of immigrants and you are growing up in South London and you don't have much money, guess what? Going to Oxford does change your life. It really does. There's not that much social mobility in England, but Oxford is a way in to a completely different life for yourself and your children. And it has opened a lot of doors for me. So, yeah, it's extreme. It's definitely extreme, but for me, it worked. It worked. So that's my truth. Yeah. With
you and you, like you say, your sons are very, very little. Still, how do you think that your upbringing will influence the way that you raise them? Like, are there already things that you're doing or conversations that you're having with your husband, but perhaps you have slightly different views on how to approach things?
Yeah, my husband is very different. He is American. He grew up in New Hampshire. He didn't have the sort of same tough love upbringing that I had. But, one of the things that my mother did for me or taught me was she would make us divide our days into 3 equal parts. So obviously 24 hours in a day, 3 equal parts of 8 hours each. And there would be sort of 8 hours obviously allocated for sleeping, is what she would say. 8 hours to be spent in school, roughly, give or take. And she always encouraged us to spend the last 8 hours of our day working towards our dreams. Because in her mind, everybody in the world generally sleeps for 7 or 8 hours, right? Most people. Most people, if they're lucky enough to just have one job, will typically spend roughly 8 hours in the office if they're working a 9 to 5. So the only thing that's ever going to set you apart or distinguish you from everyone else is really how you spend the last 8 hours of your day. That's it. Because the other 16 hours are already spoken for. It's already accounted for. So all you have to work with is the last 8 hours of your day. And that is what distinguishes one person from the next. And I think that as a mother now myself, I'm very conscious of how I spend my time. And I can see that sort of seeping into how I raise my children. Obviously, when you become a mom, structuring the last 8 hours of your day is quite difficult because it's hard because, the last 8 hours of your day don't really belong to you. They belong to your kids. You have to put them to bed, you play with them when they come home. When I come home from work, you play with them, you do bedtime stories, read, bath time, etc. And so really now that I'm a mum of 2, the last 8 hours of my day is, the last really 2 to 3 hours. But I see it sort of impacting how I want my kids to spend their time. Again, they're very young, so I don't really have to think about this too much yet. But in the future, I can see that being a big part of it. Also, one of the things that I love about my childhood is the emphasis on community that we had growing up. I talk about in the book that when I was accepted into Oxford, my mother told me that people in our village in Imama threw a massive party in my honor. That when people had heard about this achievement, that there was dancing in the street, people dancing on top of cars, drinking into the night. And I remember being so moved. I was so moved that people that I had never met, that I had never even spoken to, whose names I did not know, could be so happy to see me do well. That they could be so happy for me to see me do well, because there is this thing in Nigerian culture that success for one is success for all. And that community spirit is something that I really am trying to figure out ways to replicate it here in New Jersey, where I'm raising my kids. This idea that, in Nigeria, anyone, for example, this is just an example, can come to your wedding. A wedding in Nigeria is not an exclusive thing. If you meet somebody, if you happen to have met someone once, or even if you're just walking past a place that happens to be holding a wedding, you can absolutely walk on in. You're more than welcome, because again, a celebration for one is a celebration for everybody. Even when a couple gets married, for example, they're appointed what's known as, in my culture at least, marriage sponsors. And that is a couple who may have been married, let's say, for a lot longer, 40, 50 years, who meets with the newlyweds every so often, just to explain to them the ups and downs of married life and what to watch out for and how to prepare yourself. So this idea that really you're never in anything alone. You're never alone. You have an entire community behind you. And that, I think, is why when my mother went through what we went through when my dad passed away, I was 5 years old, so I was still sort of navigating and trying to distill what everything meant. But, that feeling that there was an entire community behind us in Nigeria standing to support us is a really powerful one. And I'm not entirely sure how I replicate it here, but I'm thinking of ways.
And do you think that has something to do with the fact, I watched your TED Talk and you were talking about your feelings about competition, about how, actually let's turn a blind eye to competition. Do you think that plays a part? Because if we actually focus on helping each other and trying to raise each other up and support each other rather than competing, then it benefits us all.
Absolutely. I've seen my mum get so excited when I share news with her about my friends, for example. If my friend scores an amazing job, or, if I have a friend who's an actress who gets a wonderful part in a movie, my mum will cheer and cry tears of happiness, almost as if I had achieved it. And I'm like, Mum, it's not me, it's them. And she's so happy. And that is the kind of, that's who Nigerians are, that again, I want to emphasize that Nigeria has a lot of problems, don't get me wrong, but that is something that, you can't take away from us. This idea that we are all in it together, this spirit of communion, togetherness. And so this idea of competition, I was raised really to turn a blind eye to it. I was raised just not to feed into it and not believe in it. And I was raised to sort of help people who might seem on paper as quote unquote my competition, because there really is enough to go around. And by the way, every time that I have helped somebody else, there's never been less for me. There's never been a situation whereby I've ever regretted it. Like, oh gosh, I shouldn't have helped her because now I'm not going to, no. And so I was raised to sort of believe that kind of thinking, that kind of scarce mentality is actually, you're feeding into an illusion that isn't there. And so it's a difficult thing to do, but once you start doing it, it becomes much easier and it just becomes a value that you hold dear, that when people ask you for help, it doesn't matter whether they're in the same profession as you, or whether they're quote unquote competing for the same job as you help them, So that's the example that I was given growing up. And so that is what I try to replicate.
And talking about, amazing achievements and celebrations, I love the description that you give in your book about the moment that your mum was invited to Buckingham Palace to see your brother Chiwetel be awarded. Is that a CBE he got?
He got an OBE and a CBE.
Oh, right.
He got both. But
that moment where, being invited to Buckingham Palace, I mean, that's incredible.
Incredible. And so I think for my mum especially, it was sort of like, having lived in England for, at that time, it must have been, let me try and do the math. She moved in the early 70s. So by the time my brother was given the OBE, it would have been around 40 years. Yeah, exactly. And so she had a hard life in this country, raising 4 kids, obviously being pregnant with my sister when my father passed away. And when you are a single mother, it is hard regardless. When you're a single mother and you're an immigrant, it is much harder because you don't have the same network of people, of family members to lean on as you would if you were born and raised in England. So it wasn't like she could just go over to her mother's house down the street and ask for help with the kids. My grandmother did come for a little bit, but she is based in Nigeria, as is my grandfather, and all of her, cousins and aunts and uncles and her own siblings were based in different parts of the world. So for that period, she really was alone. And so, she never felt, on top of that she really ever fit into British society at all. She always felt that she was the odd one out, especially going to school in this country in the early 70s, which is very different in terms of accepting immigrants compared to now. And so this feeling that, because obviously I talk about this whole community spirit. So she went to Buckingham Palace feeling that she wasn't just sort of representing herself and my dad, but really an entire community. She really felt like the village of Imama, of Oye, of Oyofu-Oye, where we're from, was behind her and was walking with her into the palace at that moment. And so it was so, so powerful for her, especially that she chose to wear, Nigerian clothes, to sort of show the world that she was unmistakably Nigerian. I mean, yeah, that was a really sort of powerful moment for her, because it's when you live life messily. You don't really sit down and analyze and distill the meaning of your experiences. Nobody has time to do that. And so that moment really gave her pause and gave her a minute to really reflect on everything she had been through and all the choices that she made that led her to that moment. I talk about in the book that when my brother wanted to act, initially there was a moment that my mother wasn't a fan of it, because she was just sort of like, what? You want to be an actor? What's that? Like, you can actually put food on the table as an actor? What are you talking about? And, she initially wanted him to be a doctor or a lawyer, anything that's sort of easier to explain to her friends. But when the teachers at my brother's school sat her down and said, listen, I've got to tell you that you would be nuts. You would be literally insane not to let this boy act. He's so talented. She began to realize, maybe there's something here. And I talk about in the book the fact that she, after she sort of made the decision and accepted that he was going to be an actor, she taught herself Shakespeare in order to push him to be better. This is my mother who, by the way, whose education was interrupted by war. There were 2.5 years during her childhood where she never went to school at all. And so her sitting there trying to teach herself Shakespeare as a single mom, working, she ran a pharmacy in Brixton, and each day she would try to take a different play. One day or one week it would be Measure for Measure. The next time it would be, Midsummer Night's Dream, and she would just sort of really try to read through it to push him to be better. And they would rehearse together. My mother would play one part. Who knows if she understood what she was saying, but she would play one part and he would play the other part. And so she'd fought for all of us individually in our chosen professions. And so it was a really proud moment for her.
It's amazing. Now, looking back over everything that's happened, what's the one thing that you think your father would be most proud of?
I think he would be most proud of my mother. this idea that he had, she had, through all of that pain, through all of that. My mother suffered in her life, not just one great tragedy, but two in a way, because during the Biafra War, her younger brother died as well, he was a child at the time. So it was that. And then with the loss of my father, I think my father would be so proud of that my mother had managed through all that pain, had channeled it towards us and towards giving us a better life in the best way that she could. And so I think that the fact that she managed to stand on her own 2 feet through all of that it even makes me teary-eyed. I recently, 2.5 years ago, I turned 36. And that was the same age that my mother was when she went through that tragedy. And it really haunted me because I cannot even imagine getting that kind of a phone call now. Cannot even imagine it. And the fact that she went through it pregnant, by the way, and emerged and pushed herself through it and tapped into that inner strength that she had. I think that my father would be most proud of that.
Yeah. Well, where the children take us, it is moving, it's inspiring, it's absorbing, it's just, I urge everyone listening to get hold of a copy. It's out on 28th of April. Zain, a huge thank you for chatting to me today. It's been absolutely delightful to chat to you. Remind us where we can find you online to hear more from you.
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram relatively frequently at Zain Asher CNN, and on Twitter at Zain Asher, and I have a website, zainasher.com. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.